Hello and welcome. This is Cheryl. I hope you're having a great day. Thank you so much for stopping by. In this video, we're going to create these two cards here, and I'm going to share with you some different ways to apply wax paste and to use it in different ways. The first thing we're going to do is I'm going to emboss the backgrounds for my cards. I'm using some 3D embossing folders, and before I put them in the embossing folder, I take my cardstock and I mist it a couple times on each side. This just makes the paper a little bit more pliable. I also run it through the machine back and forth a few times just to really get the paper pressed into those grooves. I'm going to do the second one here, and I'm going to use some black cardstock. So you see the difference that the paste looks on light cardstock versus black cardstock. It's really, really pretty on the dark. I just love it. So I'm going to do the same process, mist my paper, put it back and forth through the machine a couple times, and just look at that texture. I absolutely love 3D embossing folders for the extra texture they give. Now for my main image, I'm using peel off stickers. If you've seen any of my last videos, you'll know that I have a large stash of them that I'm trying to use up. You could also stamp and emboss an image. That would work well for this technique as well. Then you can just avoid what I'm about to show you here. I'm doing the image on distress heavy stock, and I've got a piece of tape backing that's the same size as the piece of heavy stock that I'm working on. And the tape backing is from when I work with Suk Wang or double-sided tape sheets. I always save the backings. There's many, many ways to use them, and they're handy to have around. So I'm putting my peel off sticker onto the tape backing, but I'm putting it with the sticky side up. The tape backing is kind of going to have some static to it, so it's going to help it to lie flat. And by doing it this way with the tape side up, I can make sure to avoid any stretching or distortion of the image of the peel off sticker. If you get tape stuck to or the backing stuck to your fingers, you can just use wet fingers, lick them, or use a thing of water. And then as you just saw, I put my paper down onto the tape backing, and I get a perfect alignment on that piece of distress heavy stock. It works every single time. I'm using Inka Gold here. This is a metallic paste that is water soluble, so you'll see me misting my paste here and just letting them sit for a bit. This purple one had a spot of mold. There's natural ingredients in Inka Gold, and sometimes they mold, but in this 6 here, I had one that had a tiny little spot. It's just on the surface, and I remove it with a baby wipe and continue. I just wanted to make sure to mention it, so if that is something that bothers you or that is something that you are very sensitive to, you are aware of it. I have never had much of an issue with this. I like the Inka Gold despite this because of the fact that it is water soluble, so there are more techniques that you can use it for. So if it does dry out or gets a little bit hard, you can just spray it with some water, let it sit for about a while, let it absorb, and it'll start to rehydrate. Just make sure you don't add too much water. So I don't fill it with a tap. I always use it with a sprayer, let it sit, let it soak, so that I don't get it too sopping wet, basically. So the very first technique that I'm going to use the Inka Gold for is I'm going to watercolor my image. And because I'm able to watercolor with it as well as use it for some other techniques, I can create cards where all of the elements are perfectly coordinating with each other, and I don't have to go around trying to find matching cardstock or matching specialty cardstock or whatever to go with it. I just find it really, really handy to be able to do this. The watercolor technique is the same as pretty much any watercolor technique. I start where I want the color to be darkest, and then I work my way out, adding just kind of a little bit of water each time. The water brush that I like to use are these ones that you can put water right in the handle. That way you don't need to have a jar of water sitting on your desk. I tend to be a little bit of a klutz, so if I had a jar of water on my desk, and there are some of my videos that I've had to use them for different techniques, I tend to knock it over or whatnot. So by having a water brush that has the water right in the handle, it makes it really convenient for me, and I don't have to worry about possibly knocking something over and ruining things. It's just one thing less to worry about. So I have a paper towel on the bottom right corner here. Anytime I'm changing color or I need to take some water out of my brush, I just squeeze it onto the paper towel. If I'm changing colors, I'll rub my brush a couple times on the paper towel to take the color out of the brush. But it's so handy to have just one tool that does this and not need other things with it. You'll see as I'm working that I move the paper around. My hand really doesn't move positions all that much. I tend to move the paper around, point it to where I want the color to be the darkest, and then spread the color out. I find by doing it this way, I don't have to manipulate my hand into weird positions in order to paint. The other thing that I tend to do is I will not really have my hand as much as possible, there's sometimes you can't avoid it, over parts that I've just painted, because I don't want to accidentally put my hand down into some wet paint and then ruin things. So if you're new to peel-offs and it's not something you've really seen before, they're not really made anymore. It was discontinued several years ago, and unless a new company has started bringing them out that I'm unaware of, they may be a little bit hard to find. But I know that there's probably a lot of us that have a ton of them in our stash, as well as the fact that my local store still has some. They're pretty picked over, but there are some still available. But like I said, with this technique, you could stamp and emboss an image. The watercolor part of the technique will work exactly the same. I just wanted to give people a different idea of how to use some of their peel-offs up, as well as an alternative if you don't happen to have them. And if you're curious what colors and what tools I'm using, they will all be listed below in the description. Like I said, I like Inka Gold for the watercolor properties or the water-soluble properties. You could replace that with a different type of wax paste. For most of these projects on these cards, they will work. Obviously, if your wax paste isn't water soluble, and I'm not sure if there's other companies of wax paste that are, then it won't work for watercoloring, but you could use just a brush or another tool to color in your images. Now, I've had my Inka Gold for many, many, many years, and when I say that, I probably mean like 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. I have no idea, but it's a long, long time. And you can see that there's still a lot in most of them. The amount that comes in a container, it goes a long way. It lasts a really, really long time. So while it might be an initial investment when you first get it, it does last a really, really, really long time. Obviously, depending on how much you use it, but I've used these many, many times, and I've even used them for class samples when I was teaching classes and stuff like that. It goes a really, really long way. So it's something that you'll have for many, many years. And I like the fact that if these happen to dry out, I can get them back. I can rehydrate them. So it's not a waste of a product if it happens to dry out. Now, like I said, I don't know if there's other companies that have water soluble ones. Once I got mine, I wasn't looking for any type of metallic wax paste. So I really haven't kept up with what has been introduced and what hasn't. So if you know of another brand or whatnot that is water soluble, put it in the comments. I'm really curious, but I just don't know of any. So you can see that I'm almost done my watercoloring. When you watercolor with these, it does stay wet for a little bit longer than the other techniques that I'm using in here, but they do dry quite fast. When I rub them right on paper, it's almost dried instantly, and you'll notice in one of the next techniques that I go back in to get some more very, very frequently, like every few seconds, because it dries so fast on the paper. Because when we do the watercoloring, we're adding water to it. It does take a little bit longer to dry, but it still dries quite fast. Like the flowers of these and probably the leaves are already dry at this time when I'm watercoloring my sky. Now, if you want a color to be a little bit darker, when the ink is dry, when Inka Gold is dry, you can go in and add another coat. It is going to rehydrate the coat underneath, but it will layer on top of it and it will make it a little bit darker if you were wanting it. And you'll notice that for most of the areas except for the sky, I had a light color and a dark color that I blended together just to get a little bit more dimension, to get a little bit more shadow. It just makes your images look just a little bit better, to have a little bit of shadow to them, some lights and dark areas. So my image is nearly done. Right now I'm just finished. I'm going to clean my brush off and put them to the side so that they can dry while I'm working on my backgrounds. So the very first background I'm going to do is this black swirly one, and I'm going to use the green paste, and I'm using a Collage brush. It's a nice brush with a short handle. It's meant for using collage glue, but I really like it for this application because you get a really small amount of the paste on the brush, and it spreads it out really, really nicely, and you get a really pretty subtle look, but it enhances all of the nooks and crannies of this embossing folder. And because this paste is water soluble, once I'm done with this brush, I can go and wash it off at the tap. You don't even need to use soap if you don't want to. You can if you want to, but you don't necessarily need it. And I can have a clean brush for the next time I need to use it. But you can add as much or as little as you want. You could stop anytime, but by having a collage brush like this and just adding a little bit at a time, it's one of those things you can never take it away if you've added too much, but you can always add a little bit more. So I really like using the collage brush with some of the backgrounds for this because you have a little bit more control here. For the next background, I'm going to use my fingers to spread it out onto the background. Now, same as I said before, less is more. And what I mean by that is add a little bit, and if you want more, add more. Don't be heavy-handed with it right off the bat because you can't take excess away if you ended up getting a little bit too much on there. So I'm using 2 colors here, and I'm using 2 different fingers for each of the colors. I do make a mix-up at one point and put the wrong color in the wrong pot, but it actually doesn't make any difference. If you happen to get a little bit of contamination like that and it bothers you, you can take a baby wipe and wipe it right out, but I never find that it makes a huge difference. But you'll see as I go through here, I've got this sped up several times. It does take a little while to do a whole background. Because the Inka Gold dries so quickly on the paper, I'm going in every few seconds to get a little bit more. If you find that it's too dry, you can spritz your Inka Gold and get it a little bit more wet. But I do find that when I do spritz it, the color gets diluted a little bit more than if I'm using it straight out of the pot like this where the water has absorbed in. So just be aware, if you want a lighter, more translucent color, spritz it and just water it down a little bit and you can get that. So the very first little bit I'm just putting colors in different areas, and then afterwards I'm going in and I'm just adding a little bit more, darkening some areas, putting a little bit more of a transition between the pink and the purple. I don't necessarily want some areas that are too easy to see pink and purple, so I do want them transitioning into each other. And you can see from what I did there, those colors are completely dry already. To clean off my fingers, I'm just using a baby wipe. It wipes right off super easily. I ended up getting a tiny little bit under my nail, so you see me picking it out there, but it dries off really, really quickly and easily. You could also use just a tap and water. That would work as well. I'm taking my backgrounds and I'm cutting them down to 4 inches by 5 1/4. I always do this after they're embossed because some embossing powders kind of warp the paper a little bit and the paper gets a little bit smaller. So when you're wanting it to be an exact size, it's best to do this after it's completely embossed and it's dry. So once we have it dry, I am taking the Inka Gold again and I'm just going around the edges just to kind of finish it off a little bit. It's one of those things that's very subtle. You don't really see a lot of this color around the edges, but I do think it helps to frame it and finish it off a little bit, and I really like the end result of that. I'm going to do this on both of the pieces. On the second one, even though I use pink and purple for the background, I'm only using purple to go around the edges. I don't feel the need to go with 2 different colors. Once again, we're just framing it. It just finishes it off, and I think going with 2 different colors to do this part would be a little bit excessive, especially since you don't necessarily notice it. It's not blatant. So once we've got those all dried, I'm taking my image pieces and I'm cutting them out. Now I just have a pair of detail cutting scissors. These are my favorite. I've had them for many, many, many years and they're still as sharp as the day I got them. I did the rest of it off screen just because it's really not very fun to look at and to watch. Now, what I wanted to do was I wanted to have a mat behind my image pieces here, but rather than matching cardstock to it, I decided to use my Inka Gold to color cut cardstock to match it exactly. I also wanted the edges to be rounded because the image piece has rounded corner. I thought it looked a little bit better to round the corner on these pieces of cardstock, and I actually accidentally messed one up and had to recut into another one. So I'm taking my Inka Gold here and I'm just going around the edges of these mats here. I don't need to do the center part. The image piece is going to cover that, so I only need to do it around the edges. Saves time, saves product, and there's no point in doing something unnecessary that's going to be covered up anyways. So going around these edges, it works super quick. It's pretty much the same technique as doing the background on the embossing folders, except that we have flat paper here and we're just doing the edges that are seen. So I'm going to do the one in the green here for this one, and then I'm going to go back and do the exact same process, but I'm going to do it for the second card, and I'm going to do it in the purple color. I did most of that off camera just because the process is exactly the same. So now I'm going to take my peel off stickers, and I've got some sentiments for them, and I'm going to color them to match the colors of my cards. I'm using Copic markers for this. Copic markers are transparent, so you will see a little bit of the actual sticker color through it. You could also do this with Sharpies as well. And you'll notice I do it later. I'll touch the green one up with some Sharpie. This works best with dark Copic colors because they are transparent. So I'll do one coat on each of the peel offs, and then I go back in and do another one just to darken the color. Now I've got one here that's a gold color and one that's a silver. I have better luck covering the color of the silver ones than the gold. Sometimes the gold shows through a little bit, but in this case I don't mind. Again, it works better with darker colors than lighter colors. These peel offs also come in black. It would not work on black because Copics are transparent. You see the black right through. Even with Sharpies, you wouldn't be able to see the color through the black, like the black would show through. So definitely only do it on, or only try it on, gold or silver. So once I have them done, I'm peeling them off and putting them onto the color that I want to go onto the front, onto the card. In some cases, if you have flat areas on the card, you can put it right onto the card, but because there's so much texture here, I wanted to put it on its own little mat, and because everything in this card is totally framed, I just thought it would look better to have it on a mat or on a piece of cardstock that was coordinating and then matted. So I'm doing that for the happy birthday, and then I'm cutting down the congratulations. I always cut these down after I put the stickers down. Sometimes it's a little bit hard to get stickers in exactly the right spot, so by cutting them down afterwards, you can ensure you've got nice placement on your sentiment. I'm using a little mini trimmer for this, just a little bit easier than using my full-size trimmer. And then I'm going to mat these up and trim those mats. And I have the mats trimmed fairly narrowly. I didn't want to see a whole lot of the mat around it, but just a little bit was perfect. As an alternative, I could take the Inka Gold with my finger and go around the edges, but I figured putting them on cardstock would be a little bit neater. So when you're gluing down 3D embossed paper, there is a lot of texture. So you want to make sure that you're generous with the glue, and you could either hold it down, or I like to use an acrylic block, and then I will take a glass jar that I have that's got some beads in it that's heavy, and I will put that on top of it just to really hold it in place while it's being glued down. I'm going to do that to my second one here, and you can see that I am running out of glue, and this is why I always have at least one backup, so I'll replace it in just a moment. So once again, be generous with the glue. There's not as much texture with this wood grain embossed paper, so I'm not as worried about it as the Swirl one. So I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to put it on my card base, and I'm going to put an acrylic block on there. And then I'm going to go and put my image pieces on their mats, and as well I'm going to put acrylic blocks down on them just to hold them down while they dry. By doing this, I can work on other things while those are drying and not need to really pay a whole lot of attention to them. But I do find having the acrylic blocks on them are helpful. I like to use liquid glue to glue things together. I find it stays so much better. I'm using distressed collage medium for this. I use it often when I'm putting glue cards together, because if anything happens to squeeze out, it's completely dry and it's matte, so you don't typically see it. On this instance, you'd probably see it on the mat that I put the metallic, or put the Inka Gold on, just because it has a bit of metallic shimmer to it, but most of the time something doesn't ooze out here. So I'm going to put the Sharpie over top of the congratulations, just because I wasn't finding the color as bright as I wanted it to. Even though the sticker is on some black cardstock, this will work because the black will still show through. I couldn't do this on the happy birthday one because it's on a light cardstock. If I did this, it would just make a mess of my whole mat. While that dries, I'm going to glue my image pieces onto the card bases, and because we are gluing them right onto the textured pieces, I'm going to use those same acrylic blocks again and my same jars to weigh them down, just to really hold everything down while it's drying. And while those are drying, I decided I wanted to have a little bit of a mat around the black congratulations sentiment. So I had taken my Inka Gold and inked a piece. I'm going to put my sentiment onto that green piece as a mat and trim it. And then I want them to have a little bit of dimension as well, so I'm going to use some 3D foam dots to put on the back of them just so that those pop out of the card. So off screen, I got my sentiments ready. My image pieces are glued onto my card bases, and those are completely dry. I've got the 3D foam pop dots on the back of my sentiments already, so I can just place them right onto the card. I don't feel the need to add any more adhesive, but if you felt that those 3D foam pop dots weren't going to stick as well as you wanted them to, you could add a little bit of the liquid glue as well. Now I did find that my image piece on the card on the left was lifting up, so I did go back and add another squirt of glue to it and let it dry a little bit more. But there are the finished cards, completely coordinated, all using wax paste for the different techniques. Thank you so much for joining me. Have a great day.